Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of the most powerful and difficult stories in all of Scripture. A story that has haunted and inspired believers for millennia. We're exploring the account of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, where a father was asked to sacrifice his beloved son, where faith was tested to its absolute breaking point, and where God revealed something profound about his own nature and his ultimate plan for humanity. This is a story of obedience that defies understanding, of trust pushed beyond every reasonable limit, of a test so severe that it seems almost cruel, until we see what it reveals about the God who tests and the sacrifice he himself would one day provide. From the ancient ziggurat-studded plains of Mesopotamia to a lonely mountain in Canaan, from a promise spoken to a childless old man to a knife raised over a miracle son, this is the story of faith at its most costly and most profound. So without further ado, let's begin. The city of Ur rose from the Mesopotamian plain like a monument to human ambition and divine pretension. Its massive ziggurat dominated the skyline, a stepped pyramid of mud brick that climbed toward the heavens, crowned with a temple to Nanna, the moon god. At night, when the moon hung full over the Euphrates, priests performed their rituals on that artificial mountain, convinced they were drawing near to deity, maintaining cosmic order, ensuring the favour of the gods who controlled their world. It was a sophisticated city, Ur of the Chaldeans. Its streets were paved, its houses substantial, its economy robust. The royal tombs discovered by archaeologists would later reveal the wealth and culture of this ancient metropolis. Golden helmets, intricate jewellery, elaborate death pits where servants were sacrificed to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. This was not a primitive backwater, but one of the great urban centres of the ancient world, a place where civilization flourished, where trade routes converged, where the gods were many and their worship was woven into every aspect of life. In this city, in this culture saturated with idolatry and confident in its own grandeur, lived a man named Abram. His name meant exalted father, which must have carried increasing irony as the years passed and he remained childless. In a world where sons meant security, legacy, and the hope of immortality through descendants, Abram had none. He was married to Sarai, a woman whose beauty was notable but whose womb was barren. Together they navigated the social shame and personal grief of childlessness, in a culture that measured a man's worth partly by the size of his household and the number of his offspring. Abram's father was Terah, a man about whom we know little, except that he initiated a journey that he would never complete. For reasons the text does not explain, Terah decided to leave Ur and travel toward Canaan. Perhaps it was economic opportunity, perhaps family dynamics, perhaps something we can no longer recover from the ancient past. But Terah gathered his household, his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, and his grandson Lot, and they left the great city of Ur, travelling northwest along the arc of the Fertile Crescent. They settled in Haran, another major city, another centre of moon worship, this one in northern Mesopotamia. It was a natural stopping point on the trade routes, similar enough to Ur to feel familiar, distant enough to represent a new beginning. And there, in Haran, Terah's journey ended. He lived out his days in this transplanted community of expatriates from Ur, and eventually, at the age of 205, he died. The journey he had begun would be completed by his son, but not to any destination Terah could have imagined. After Terah's death, something extraordinary happened. The Lord appeared to Abram and spoke words that would reshape not just one man's life, but the entire trajectory of human history. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. The command was radical in its scope and vague in its details. Leave your country, abandon the security of familiar territory, the protection of known laws, the comfort of shared culture. Leave your kindred, separate from your extended family, the network of relationships that provided identity and support in the ancient world. Leave your father's house. Walk away from inheritance, from clan loyalty, from everything that defined who you were in that society, and go where? To the land that I will show you, not to a specific destination that Abram could plan for, prepare for, investigate before committing. Just go, and I will show you when you get there. It was an invitation to walk into complete uncertainty based solely on the trustworthiness of the one giving the command. But the command came with promises that were as staggering as the command itself was demanding. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonours you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. A great nation. To a man who was 75 years old, married to a barren woman, with no children and no immediate prospect of any. A great nation. Not just descendants, not just a family, but a nation. A people numerous enough to occupy territory, to establish culture, to make an impact on surrounding peoples. And more than that, blessing. Blessing for Abram himself, yes, but also blessing that would flow through him to others. He would become a conduit of divine favour. Those who treated him well would receive blessing. Those who cursed him would face consequences. And ultimately, comprehensively, overwhelmingly, all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. It was a promise of cosmic scope wrapped in a personal call. A vision of global impact given to one childless nomad being told to leave everything familiar and walk into the unknown. Abram went. The text is remarkably concise about this moment that must have involved countless conversations, practical preparations, and emotional upheaval. Abram went, as the Lord had told him. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. He was 75 years old. This was not a young man in the prime of life striking out to make his fortune. This was an old man by the standards of that time, long past the age when people typically uprooted their lives and started over. Yet at 75, Abram obeyed a voice that called him away from everything he knew towards something he could not yet see. The journey from Haran to Canaan took them southwest, back along the trade routes, then south through Syria and into the hill country that would become the land of promise. When they arrived in Canaan, they found it was not empty wilderness waiting to be occupied, but a land already inhabited by the Canaanites. This was not virgin territory, but occupied space, controlled by peoples with their own cultures, their own gods, their own claims to the land. Abram travelled through the land to the place at Shechem, to the Oak of Moreh. It was there, in the midst of Canaanite territory, that the Lord appeared to him again and added specificity to the promise. To your offspring I will give this land. Not to you personally necessarily. Abram would remain a nomad, a stranger in this land all his life. But to your offspring, to the descendants who did not yet exist, to the nation that had been promised to a childless old man. Abram's response was worship. He built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. It was a declaration of loyalty, a staking of spiritual claim in a land that worshipped other gods. The altar at Shechem was the first of many Abram would build, markers of his journey and monuments to his faith, places where he called on the name of the Lord in a land saturated with Baal worship and devotion to Canaanite deities. From there he moved to the hill country east of Bethel, pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and built another altar there and called upon the name of the Lord. This pattern would mark his life, travelling, pitching his tent temporarily, building altars as permanent testimonies to the God who had called him. He was a nomad who owned no land but staked spiritual claims wherever he went, a stranger who belonged to the territory not by possession but by promise. But the journey was not one of uninterrupted faith and smooth progress. A famine struck the land, severe enough to threaten survival, and Abram made a decision that revealed how faith and fear could coexist in the same heart. He went down to Egypt to sojourn there, seeking provision where Canaan offered none. It was a reasonable decision in practical terms, but a failure of trust in theological terms. God had brought him to this land and promised it to his offspring. Would the same God allow him to starve? Could famine thwart divine promise? In Egypt, another kind of failure emerged. Sarai was beautiful, even in her 60s, and Abram feared that Egyptian men would kill him to take her. So he instructed her to say she was his sister. Technically true, she was his half-sister, but deliberately deceptive in context. Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's household, and Abram prospered through the connection, receiving sheep, oxen, donkeys, servants, and camels. But God intervened, afflicting Pharaoh's household with plagues because of Sarai. When Pharaoh discovered the deception, his response was not violence but rebuke. "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Abram, the man called to be a blessing to nations, was sent away by a pagan king who had more integrity in that moment than the patriarch himself. They returned to Canaan wealthier but humbled, back to the altars Abram had built earlier, back to calling on the name of the Lord. The experience in Egypt revealed both the fragility of Abram's faith and the faithfulness of God who protected his promise despite the patriarch's failures. Sarai was returned unharmed. The promise remained intact, but the incident foreshadowed a pattern. Abram would struggle with trust, would resort to human schemes, would fail in various ways, yet God's commitment to the covenant would prove stronger than Abram's wavering faith. The possessions they had accumulated created new tensions. Abram and Lot both had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not support them dwelling together. Strife arose between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen, complicated by the fact that the Canaanites and Perizzites were dwelling in the land. The conflict between family members was happening in front of the peoples who actually controlled the territory, making the family look weak and divided. Abram, as the elder, and the one to whom God had appeared, could have claimed first choice of the land, but instead he offered Lot the choice. "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot looked up and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. The comparison was significant. Like Eden, like Egypt, the two paradigms of abundant life and provision. Without apparent thought for his uncle's generosity or the spiritual implications of his choice, Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. The text adds an ominous note. The men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. After Lot separated from him, the Lord spoke to Abram again. "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever." It was a renewal and expansion of the promise, coming precisely at the moment when Abram had given up his right to choose the best land. He surrendered control, and God expanded the promise. Every direction he could see, it would belong to his offspring, and more. "I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted." Dust of the earth, innumerable, vast beyond calculation. To a man who still had no child, God promised descendants beyond counting. Abram moved his tent and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built another altar to the Lord. Hebron would become his primary dwelling place, the area where he would spend most of his remaining years, waiting for the fulfillment of promises that seemed increasingly impossible by natural means. But the land was not peaceful. War broke out among the kings of the region, a conflict that swept up Lot because of his proximity to Sodom. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led his trained men, 318 of them, in a nighttime raid to rescue Lot and recover the captured goods. It was a remarkable military success, showing that Abram could operate effectively in the world of political and military power when necessary. After the victory, 2 meetings occurred that revealed different approaches to wealth and blessing. The king of Sodom offered to let Abram keep all the recovered goods if he would just return the people. But Abram swore an oath. "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich.'" He would not allow any human ruler to claim credit for his prosperity. Whatever wealth came to him would come from God, not from political alliances or military conquest. But before meeting the king of Sodom, Abram encountered a mysterious figure, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. This enigmatic character brought out bread and wine and blessed Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything, acknowledging this priest-king's spiritual authority. The encounter was brief, but pregnant with significance. Here was a priest of the true God who existed outside the line of Abraham, who had authority that Abram recognized and honored. Centuries later, David would write of the Messiah as a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and the New Testament would explore the connection between this mysterious king-priest and Jesus Christ. But for Abram, it was a reminder that God was at work beyond the boundaries of his family, that the promise to bless all families of the earth was already beginning to manifest in unexpected ways. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." But Abram's response revealed the ache beneath all the promises, the one thing that made every other blessing feel incomplete. "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." He had a servant who would inherit everything if he died without offspring. All the land, all the promises, all the blessing, what did it matter without a son to receive it? "This man shall not be your heir," God responded. "Your very own son shall be your heir." Then God brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." The night sky over Canaan, unpolluted by city lights, revealed countless stars scattered across the darkness. "So shall your offspring be." And Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. That moment of faith, that choice to trust God's promise despite every natural impossibility, was credited to Abram as righteousness. Not his obedience in leaving Ur, not his altar building, not his military victory, not his tithe to Melchizedek, but this simple act of believing what God said. This was what established Abram as righteous in God's sight. The pattern was established. God called, Abram obeyed, sometimes fully, sometimes partially, sometimes with failures along the way. God promised, Abram believed, sometimes immediately, sometimes after questioning, sometimes with doubt that needed to be addressed. But through it all, the relationship deepened. The covenant was being established. The foundations were being laid for a people who did not yet exist, for a blessing that would eventually reach all the families of the earth. Abram did not know, could not have known, that the son God promised would one day carry wood up a mountain for his own sacrifice. He could not have imagined the test that would come, the knife that would be raised, the moment when everything, all the promises, all the waiting, all the hope, would seem to hang by a thread on a mountain called Moriah. But that test was coming, decades in the future, after years of more waiting, more struggles with faith, more divine interventions, and finally the birth of the impossible son. For now, Abram was a nomad in Canaan, living in tents, building altars, looking up at stars and believing they represented his future descendants. He was a man who had left everything familiar to follow a voice, who had wagered his life on promises that defied natural possibility, who had discovered that faith was not a one-time decision, but an ongoing choice, a daily recommitment, a persistent trust even when circumstances screamed that trust was foolish. He was the man God had called, the one through whom all families of the earth would be blessed. And though he did not know it yet, his story was just beginning. The promise of offspring had been given, but the son had not yet come. The land had been shown to him, but he owned not a square foot of it. The blessing had been pronounced, but its full dimensions would take centuries to unfold. From sophisticated Ur to semi-nomadic Haran to the hills of Canaan, Abram had journeyed in obedience to a voice that called him toward an unseen future. The altars he built marked his path, testimonies to a God who spoke and who could be trusted even when his promises seemed impossible. And somewhere in the purposes of God, the stage was being set for a test that would reveal what faith really meant, what it really cost, and what it really accomplished when pushed to its absolute limit. But first, there would be more waiting, more years, more struggles, more failures and more recoveries. And eventually, when all hope seemed lost, when nature itself declared that the promise could never be fulfilled, then would come the laughter, the joy, the miracle son who would make the test on Moriah possible. The call had been answered, the journey had begun, and the God who called was faithful, even when the one called was not, even when the way was unclear, even when the promises seemed increasingly impossible. The story of Abraham was the story of faith learning to trust, not in what could be seen, but in the character of the one who spoke, who promised, who called, and who would prove himself faithful across decades of waiting, through failures and recoveries, all the way to a mountain where everything would be tested and everything would be revealed. The stars Abram had been told to number continued their nightly procession across the Canaanite sky, and with each passing month, each turning season, the promise they represented seemed to recede further into impossibility. Abram believed God, and that faith had been counted to him as righteousness. But belief and patience are different virtues, and as the years accumulated with no sign of the promised son, the tension between divine promise and natural reality became increasingly difficult to bear. Sarai felt it most acutely. She was the one whose womb remained closed, whose body refused the fertility that the promise required. In a culture that measured a woman's worth largely by her ability to bear children, particularly sons, barrenness was not just personal grief, but social shame. She watched other women in the household bear children, watched servants give birth while she remained empty, watched Abram grow older with no heir of his own body except through her. Finally, she conceived a plan that was both pragmatic and desperate, culturally acceptable and spiritually disastrous. She spoke to Abram with a proposal that must have emerged from years of accumulated pain. "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." The servant was Hagar, an Egyptian woman who had perhaps joined the household during their time in Egypt. According to the customs of the ancient Near East, children born to a wife's servant through her husband would be legally considered the wife's children. It was a socially acceptable solution to the problem of barrenness, a way to secure an heir within the bounds of cultural norms. But it was also a failure to wait for God's specific promise, a human scheme to accomplish through natural means what God had said he would accomplish supernaturally. Abram listened to the voice of his wife. The text's phrasing carries a subtle echo of another garden, another husband listening to his wife's voice with disastrous consequences. Not that Sarai was wrong in wanting children, but that both she and Abram were taking matters into their own hands rather than waiting on the timing and methods of the God who had promised. Hagar conceived, and immediately the household dynamic shifted. When she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. The slave girl who was pregnant now had status that her barren mistress lacked, and she made sure Sarai felt it. Sarai in turn dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled into the wilderness, preferring the dangers of the desert to the hostility of the household. The angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, and spoke to her with remarkable tenderness and authority. He told her to return and submit to Sarai, but also gave her a promise of her own. Her offspring would be multiplied so that they could not be numbered for multitude. She would bear a son, and she should call his name Ishmael, God hears, because the Lord had listened to her affliction. Hagar returned, and in time she bore Abram a son, and Abram called his name Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. The promised son had not come, but a son had come, and for 13 years Ishmael would be Abram's only son, the boy who might have been the heir, the child who complicated everything. 13 more years passed. 13 years of Ishmael growing up as Abram's son, 13 years of the household adjusting to this reality, 13 years of the promise seeming increasingly like it might be fulfilled through Ishmael rather than through a son of Sarai. Abram was now 99 years old, and Sarai was 89. The biological impossibility of a child had long since passed into absurdity. Then the Lord appeared to Abram again, and this appearance brought covenant formalization that would change everything. "I am God Almighty," the Lord declared, introducing himself with the name El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly." Abram fell on his face, and God spoke to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." The name change was significant. Abram meant exalted father. The name had become increasingly ironic with each passing childless year. Abraham meant father of a multitude, a name that declared fulfillment even before it occurred, that renamed him according to God's promise rather than present reality. From this point forward, he would be called not by what he was, but by what God said he would become. And the covenant would be eternal, God declared, not just with Abraham, but with his offspring after him throughout their generations. It would be an everlasting covenant. I will be your God, and they will be my people. More than that, the land of Canaan, where Abraham now dwelt as a sojourner, would become an everlasting possession for his descendants. But the covenant required a sign in the flesh, circumcision. Every male among them should be circumcised on the 8th day, a permanent mark in their bodies of belonging to God's covenant people. It was a sign that touched the very source of procreation, that marked the male body in a way that would forever distinguish covenant members from outsiders, that bound future generations to the promises made to Abraham. And then God specified what he had implied before. "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." Sarai meant my princess. Sarah meant simply princess, taking the possessive away, making her not just Abraham's princess, but a princess in her own right. "I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." Abraham's response was immediate and visceral. He fell on his face and laughed. Not the laughter of joy, but of incredulity, of shock so complete it could only express itself in laughter. Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? It was impossible. Biology didn't work that way. Even if God could work a miracle, this seemed to push beyond the boundaries of miracle into absurdity. And Abraham, perhaps thinking he was being realistic, offered an alternative. "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Let the promise be fulfilled through the son I already have, the boy who is 13 years old, the heir who actually exists rather than this impossible child through Sarah. But God was unmoved by Abraham's laughter or his alternative proposal. "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." Isaac, Yitzchak in Hebrew, meant he laughs. The child would be named for Abraham's incredulous laughter, for the absurdity of the promise, for the joy that would replace doubt. "I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." God acknowledged Ishmael too. Abraham's prayer would be answered. The boy would be blessed, would become the father of 12 princes, would become a great nation. But the covenant, the specific promises, the line through which all families of the earth would be blessed, that would run through Isaac, the son not yet conceived, the child who would be born at the set time in the spring. That very day Abraham took Ishmael and all the males of his household and circumcised them, as God had commanded. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael was 13. The covenant was established in flesh and blood, in pain and permanence, in a physical mark that would distinguish Abraham's descendants forever. Not long after, the Lord appeared to Abraham again, but this time in a form that seemed more tangible, more immediate. 3 men stood near him as he sat at the door of his tent by the oaks of Mamre in the heat of the day. When Abraham saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth, showing the hospitality for which he would become famous. "O Lord," he said, somehow recognizing that this was no ordinary visitation, "if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." He offered water to wash their feet, rest under the tree, and a morsel of bread to sustain them. Then he hurried into the tent to Sarah and commanded her to make cakes from fine flour, ran to the herd himself to select a tender calf, gave it to a young man to prepare, and served his guests curds and milk and the prepared calf while they ate under the tree. Then they asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham answered, "She is in the tent." And one of them, clearly now the Lord himself, said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him, and when she heard this she laughed to herself. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" It was a bitter laugh, the laugh of a woman who had given up hope, who had made peace with barrenness, who knew her body too well to believe this promise. She was past menopause, past the age of childbearing, past even the biological mechanisms that would make conception possible. The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?' At the appointed time I will return to you, about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Sarah, frightened at being called out, denied it. "I did not laugh." But the Lord responded simply, "No, but you did laugh." The denial was itself remarkable, a moment of fear before the holy, an attempt to hide what could not be hidden from the one who sees all. But the Lord's response was not angry, just factual. "Yes, you laughed. It's understandable. But I will do what I have said." After the visitors left, and after Abraham interceded for Sodom, standing before the Lord and pleading for the righteous in that wicked city, the judgment fell. Fire and brimstone rained from heaven, and Sodom and Gomorrah were overthrown. Lot and his daughters escaped, but his wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. The cities where Lot had chosen to dwell, that well-watered valley that looked like Eden and Egypt, became a smoking waste, a testimony to divine judgment and the consequences of choosing based on appearance rather than righteousness. But even as judgment fell on the cities of the plain, the promise to Abraham continued to move toward fulfillment. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and did to her as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. The impossible had happened. The promise given to a childless man at 75 had been fulfilled when he was 100. The son promised to a barren woman had been born when she was 90. Biology had been overridden. Nature had been superseded. The God for whom nothing is too hard had done what he said he would do. Sarah's response captured the transformation from bitter laughter to joyful amazement. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. The laughter of incredulity had become the laughter of joy. The laughter of doubt had been transformed into the laughter of fulfillment. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Abraham called his son Isaac as God had commanded. He laughs. The name that would forever carry the memory of how impossible this birth had been, how unlikely the promise had seemed, how thoroughly God had proven that with him nothing is impossible. On the 8th day, Abraham circumcised Isaac, bringing his son into the covenant that had been established, marking him as the child of promise, the heir through whom the blessings would flow. The child grew, and in time Sarah weaned him. Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, a celebration of the miracle child who had survived infancy and was now established as the heir. But the feast revealed tensions that had been building in the household. Sarah saw Ishmael, now a teenager of about 16 or 17, laughing, or perhaps mocking, at the celebration. The Hebrew word can mean either, but the context suggests something darker than innocent play. Ishmael, who had been the only son for 13 years, who had perhaps assumed he would be the heir, was now displaced by this younger half-brother born to the favoured wife. Sarah's response was immediate and harsh. "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." It seemed cruel, the demand to send away a woman and her teenage son into the wilderness with uncertain prospects for survival. But there was also truth in it. The household could not sustain two potential heirs, two sons with competing claims, two lines that might war against each other in future generations. The thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Ishmael was his son too, the boy he had raised for 17 years, and the prospect of sending him away grieved Abraham deeply. But God spoke to Abraham and told him to listen to Sarah. "Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named." The covenant line would run through Isaac alone, and Ishmael needed to be separated to prevent future conflict. But God also promised concerning Ishmael, "I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." The boy would not be abandoned, not left to die in the wilderness. God would care for him, bless him, make him into a nation. But that nation would develop separately from the covenant people descended from Isaac. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. The text's phrasing is poignant, "along with the child," as if Ishmael, now a teenager, was still referred to as a child in the moment of his departure, still Abraham's son even as he was being sent away. Hagar departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone, she put the child under a bush and sat down opposite him at some distance, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." She lifted up her voice and wept. But God heard the voice of the boy, "Ishmael, God hears." And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up and lived in the wilderness, and became an expert with the bow. His mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt, and he became the father of 12 princes, fulfilling the promise God had made. Back in Abraham's household, Isaac grew as the undisputed heir, the child of promise, the miracle son through whom all of God's covenant promises would flow. He was the son given when hope seemed dead, the child born through divine intervention, the living proof that God keeps his word even when circumstances make it seem impossible. 25 years had passed from God's initial call to Abraham at age 75 to Isaac's birth. When Abraham was 100, 25 years of waiting, of struggles with faith, of attempts to help God along, of failures and recoveries, of promises repeated and reassurances given. But now the son had come, the laughter child, the impossible heir. Abraham and Sarah, now in their later years, watched their miracle son grow. They had waited so long, had given up hope so many times, had tried their own schemes and seen them fail. But now Isaac was here, running through the camp, learning from his father, being prepared for the inheritance that would one day be his. They could not have known what was coming. They could not have imagined that this son, this precious child given in their old age after decades of waiting, would one day be the subject of the most difficult command God would ever give. They could not have foreseen the mountain, the altar, the knife, the test that would push faith beyond every conceivable limit. For now there was joy. For now there was the laughter child, the fulfilled promise, the son who proved that God's word was trustworthy even when every natural circumstance declared it impossible. The covenant was secure, the heir was established, and the future seemed bright with promise. But in the purposes of God, the greatest test was still ahead. The son who had been given miraculously would be asked for sacrificially. The child who proved God's faithfulness would become the means of testing Abraham's faith. And on a mountain in the land of Moriah, everything that Abraham believed about God, about promise, about trust, about obedience, all of it would be tested in a way that would echo through millennia as both the ultimate test of faith and the ultimate picture of divine love that would one day give what was being tested here. The long-awaited son had arrived. The laughter had replaced the tears. The promise had been fulfilled against all odds and contrary to all natural possibility. And somewhere in the years ahead, when Isaac had grown from infant to child to young man, God would speak again. And this time, the words would shatter everything Abraham thought he understood about the God who gives, and the faith required to follow him wherever he leads, whatever he asks, however impossible or incomprehensible his commands might be, after these things. The text uses that phrase with devastating understatement, as if what followed was merely the next episode in an ongoing narrative, rather than the moment when everything Abraham believed about God would be tested to its absolute breaking point. After these things, after the promise fulfilled, after Isaac's birth and weaning, after Ishmael's departure, after years of watching the miracle child grow, after the joy of laughter had replaced the ache of barrenness, after all these things, God tested Abraham. The Hebrew word is nasa, to test, to prove, to refine. Not to tempt, which would be to entice toward evil, but to test, which is to reveal what is truly present, to demonstrate the quality of faith under pressure, to refine gold by fire until only the pure metal remains. God tested Abraham. The text tells us this at the outset, so we understand what is happening, even as Abraham does not, so we can bear the tension of the narrative knowing that this is a test, not a capricious demand, not a change in God's character, not a betrayal of everything he had revealed about himself. But Abraham did not know it was a test. Abraham heard only the voice of God calling his name. "Abraham, here I am." It was the same response Abraham had given throughout his life when God spoke, the response of availability, of presence, of readiness to hear and obey. Here I am. Not a question, not a negotiation, not a request for clarification before committing. Just, here I am listening, I am ready. Then came the command, and each word was a knife twisting deeper into Abraham's heart. Take your son. Abraham had 2 sons, technically, but one had been sent away, and the other stood before him as the child of promise, the heir of the covenant, the son through whom all the promises would be fulfilled. Still, the command could have referred to either, so God continued, specifying with excruciating precision, your only son. Ishmael was gone. Isaac alone remained in the household, the only son under Abraham's roof, the only son of the covenant, the only heir. But even that might leave room for ambiguity, for perhaps Abraham might convince himself that God meant something else, someone else. So God continued, whom you love. 3 words in Hebrew, asher ahavta, that pierce the heart, whom you love. This was not about a son in general, an heir in abstract, a child theoretically. This was about the son Abraham loved, the miracle child given in old age, the laughter child who had brought such joy after such long waiting. The command was personal, emotional, targeted at the deepest attachment of Abraham's heart. And still God was not finished specifying. Isaac. The name itself meant he laughs. Every time Abraham said his son's name, he remembered the laughter of incredulity when God promised him, the laughter of Sarah when the visitors announced the birth, the laughter of joy when the impossible child arrived. Isaac, the specific, beloved, only son of the promise. And go to the land of Moriah. Moriah. The text does not elaborate on where this was or what it meant, but centuries later the chronicler would identify it. The mountain where Solomon would build the temple, the ridge that included the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, the high place that would become the centre of Israelite worship, and just beyond that temple mount, across a small valley, another hill called Golgotha, where another beloved son would carry wood up a mountain for his own sacrifice. But Abraham knew none of this. He knew only that he was to go to a land God would show him, an echo of the original call to leave Ur, to go to a land God would reveal, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. A burnt offering, the Olah sacrifice, the offering that was completely consumed by fire, that went up entirely to God as smoke and flame, that left nothing for the one who offered it. Not a fellowship offering where portions could be eaten, not a grain offering or a peace offering, but a burnt offering, total, complete, irrevocable. Offer Isaac, your son, your only son, whom you love, as a burnt offering. The command shattered every category Abraham had for understanding God. This was the God who had promised descendants through Isaac, who had said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named," who had established an everlasting covenant with Isaac and his descendants after him. This was the God who had given Isaac miraculously when Abraham was 100 years old, who had proved that nothing was too hard for him by opening Sarah's womb in her old age. This was the God who had just now, after decades of waiting, fulfilled his promise of a son. And now that same God was commanding Abraham to kill that son, to destroy the promise with his own hands, to sacrifice the child who was the only means by which all the covenant promises could be fulfilled. It made no sense. It contradicted everything God had said about Isaac, about the covenant, about the future. It seemed to reveal a God who gave gifts only to cruelly demand them back, who made promises only to void them, who was capricious, unpredictable, perhaps even evil. But the text records no protest from Abraham, no argument, no questioning of the command. We are given no access to his internal struggle, no diary entry revealing his thoughts during that night, no prayer recorded where he wrestled with God over this impossible demand. The silence of the text is itself agonizing, leaving us to imagine what Abraham must have felt, what he must have thought, how he must have struggled with a command that seemed to contradict everything he knew about the God who gave it. What we're told is simply this: Abraham rose early in the morning, not late, not after days of deliberation, not after consulting with Sarah or the elders of his household. Early in the morning, as if he had not slept, as if the command received in the evening required action at dawn, as if delay might weaken resolve or deepen the agony. He saddled his donkey himself. This was not a task he delegated to servants, but something he did with his own hands, a personal preparation for the journey he did not want to make but would not refuse. He took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. The servants would witness from a distance, would return with Isaac or without him, would carry back the news of what happened on the mountain. He cut the wood for the burnt offering. Each stroke of the axe or saw must have been torture, preparing the fuel for the fire that would consume his son, gathering the means by which the command would be fulfilled. The wood was not collected casually, but cut deliberately, chosen and prepared, the instrument of sacrifice readied by the father's own hands. And then they arose and went to the place of which God had told him. The destination was not fully specified, one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham began the journey knowing the direction but not the exact location, trusting that God would reveal the specific mountain when they arrived in the region of Moriah. The journey took 3 days. 3 days of walking, 3 days of silence or conversation about the journey. 3 days of looking at Isaac and knowing what awaited him on the mountain. 3 days of agony stretched out over miles and hours. 3 days during which Abraham could have turned back, could have claimed he misheard, could have found 1,000 reasons to abort this terrible mission. 3 days is long enough to reconsider a rash decision. 3 days is long enough for reason to reassert itself, for self-preservation to kick in, for love of son to override obedience to God. 3 days is long enough to construct alternative interpretations of the command, to convince yourself that God didn't really mean it literally, to find loopholes in the language or exceptions in the requirement. But Abraham continued walking. For 3 days he put one foot in front of the other, leading the donkey, accompanied by his son and 2 servants, carrying in his heart a command he wished he had never received but would not disobey. The biblical number 3 appears again, the pattern of resurrection, of redemption, of death and return to life. Jonah would be 3 days in the fish's belly. Jesus would be 3 days in the tomb, and Abraham walked for 3 days toward the death of his son, toward the destruction of all his hopes, toward the fulfillment of a command that seemed to contradict every promise God had made. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Somehow he knew, whether by divine revelation, or by inner certainty, or by the Spirit's leading, that this was the mountain. This was where it would happen. This was where the command would be obeyed or refused, where faith would be proven or abandoned, where everything would be decided. Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." The words are remarkable for what they reveal about Abraham's state of mind. I and the boy, he and Isaac together, not just the father alone, will worship. He saw what was coming as an act of worship, however agonizing, however incomprehensible. And come again to you, both of us, the plural in Hebrew, not just Abraham returning alone, but Abraham and Isaac coming back together. Was this faith or delusion? Did Abraham believe God would somehow prevent the sacrifice at the last moment? Did he believe God could raise Isaac from the dead, as the writer of Hebrews would later suggest? Did he believe the promise through Isaac was so certain that even death could not void it? Or were these words simply what he needed to say to keep the servants from interfering, to maintain some appearance of normalcy, to get Isaac alone on the mountain where the terrible thing could be done? The text does not tell us. Abraham's inner life remains hidden from us, his thoughts and feelings obscured behind the spare narrative that records actions but not emotions, obedience but not struggle. We see what Abraham did. We can only imagine what Abraham felt. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. The son carried the wood for his own sacrifice up the mountain, just as another son would carry a wooden cross up another hill in this same region 2,000 years later. Did Isaac know how heavy the wood was? Did he feel the weight of it as symbolic of something he did not yet understand? Did he wonder why his aged father did not carry the heavier burden? Abraham took in his own hand the fire and the knife. Fire to ignite the sacrifice, the knife to slaughter it. These he could not give to Isaac to carry. These he must bear himself, the instruments of death kept in the father's control until the moment they would be used. The fire perhaps in a clay pot with coals, the knife at his belt or in his hand, ready, available, waiting for the moment when faith would require him to use it. And they went, both of them together. The Hebrew emphasizes their unity, shenehem yachdav. Both of them, together, side by side. Father and son walking up the mountain in companionship, even as Abraham carried death in his hands. The phrase appears twice in this passage, highlighting the relationship even as it moves toward rupture, emphasizing the togetherness that makes the coming separation so agonizing. Then Isaac spoke to Abraham his father. It is the first time Isaac's voice appears in this narrative, the first words we hear from the boy who is about to become a sacrifice. And his words cut to the heart of the moment. My father. Here I am. My son. The exchange is tender, intimate, the normal conversation between father and son. The kind of words that had probably passed between them countless times before. But now each word carried unbearable weight. My father. The relationship invoked, the bond acknowledged. Here I am, my son. The father present, attentive, available to his beloved child even as he prepared to kill him. Isaac continued, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? The question hung in the air between them. Isaac had seen burnt offerings before, had participated in worship, understood that a sacrifice required an animal victim. They had the wood for the altar, the fire to consume it, but no lamb. Where was the sacrifice? Had they forgotten? Would they need to go back? Was this journey incomplete? Abraham's answer was prophetic in ways Isaac could not yet understand, in ways Abraham himself may not have fully grasped. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. God will provide. Yahweh Yireh. The Lord will see, will look, will provide. It was a statement of faith, a declaration of trust, a hope spoken into uncertainty. God would provide the lamb. Not we will find a lamb, not I have a lamb, not there is a lamb somewhere. But God will provide. The responsibility shifted from Abraham to God. The burden of supply moved from human effort to divine provision. For himself, the lamb, the Hebrew allows multiple readings. God will provide the lamb for himself, the sacrifice he requires. Or, God will provide himself as the lamb, God becoming the provision. Both readings were true, though Abraham could not have known how profoundly true the second reading would prove to be when God provided his own son as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. My son, Abraham added those words, tender even in this moment, claiming relationship even as he prepared to end it, expressing love even as he moved toward the most unloving act imaginable. And they went, both of them together. Again the phrase, again the emphasis on unity, on companionship, on father and son walking side by side toward the place of worship that would become the place of sacrifice, toward the moment that would test everything Abraham believed about God and everything Isaac trusted about his father. The mountain loomed before them. The wood was heavy on Isaac's shoulders. The fire and knife were ready in Abraham's hands, and with each step they moved closer to the moment when faith would require the unthinkable, when obedience would demand the unbearable, when a father would have to choose between the son he loved and the God he served. The question Isaac had asked, "Where is the lamb?" remained unanswered, except by a promise that God would provide. But how? When? In what form? Through what means? Abraham did not know. He knew only that God had commanded, and he would obey. He knew that God had promised, and somehow, impossibly, those promises would still be fulfilled even if Isaac died. The writer of Hebrews would later explain Abraham's thinking. He considered that God was able even to raise the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham's faith had grown through decades of walking with God, through the miracle of Isaac's birth when natural conception was impossible, through repeated experiences of God's faithfulness despite human failure. If God could give life to a 90-year-old womb, could he not give life to a dead body? If God's promise through Isaac was certain, would he not somehow ensure that promise survived even if Isaac died? But on the mountain, in the moment, with Isaac asking where the lamb was and Abraham answering that God would provide, the theological reasoning remained secondary to the agonizing reality. A father was about to kill his son because God commanded it, and faith required him to believe that somehow, impossibly, this would result in blessing rather than curse, in fulfillment rather than destruction, in life rather than death. They had reached the region. The mountain was identified. The place was selected. And now, with the two servants left behind and father and son alone together on the slope of Moriah, the moment of truth approached. Abraham would build an altar. He would arrange the wood. He would bind his son. And then, unless God intervened, he would raise the knife and plunge it into Isaac's heart, would watch his son's blood spill on the altar, would light the fire and watch the smoke rise as his promised heir, his beloved son, his laughter child, his only hope for the covenant's fulfillment, was consumed by flame. The command that shattered silence had brought them to this mountain. The 3-day journey had brought them to this moment. The question, "Where is the lamb?" had been answered only with, "God will provide." And now everything, all the promises, all the waiting, all the faith built over decades of walking with God, everything would be tested in what happened next on the mountain called Moriah, in the region that would one day become Jerusalem, on a ridge that would witness another sacrifice, another beloved son, another father's willingness to give what he loved most. The command had been given, the journey had been made, the mountain had been reached, and now, with fire in hand and knife at his belt and his son by his side, Abraham prepared to do the unthinkable, to obey the unbearable, to demonstrate that he loved God more than he loved the gift God had given, that he trusted the promise-maker more than he clung to the promise, that his faith could endure even the death of hope itself. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham began to build an altar. Stone by stone he constructed the platform on which his son would be laid, the place where the wood would be arranged, where the fire would be lit, where the sacrifice would be offered. Each stone was an act of obedience, each placement a step toward the unthinkable, each addition to the structure bringing him closer to the moment when faith would require him to raise the knife. Did Isaac help? Did the son assist in building the altar for his own sacrifice, not yet understanding what he was constructing? Or did he stand aside, watching his father work, perhaps puzzled by the silence, by the grimness with which Abraham set stone upon stone, by the careful precision of a man doing something he wished with all his heart he did not have to do? The text gives us no details of the construction, no description of Abraham's hands trembling or steady, no record of conversation or silence. We see only the result, an altar built, a place prepared, the stage set for what must come next. Abraham arranged the wood on the altar. The wood Isaac had carried up the mountain, the fuel his son had borne on his own shoulders, was now placed in careful order, laid out to burn hot and complete, positioned to consume what would be placed upon it, prepared to reduce flesh and bone to ash and smoke that would rise to heaven. The wood that Isaac had carried unknowingly for his own funeral pyre was ready. Then came the moment that would haunt imagination for millennia, the act so terrible that even in the sparse language of the biblical narrative it stops us cold. Abraham bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. The Hebrew word is vaya'akod, he bound him. It comes from the same root that gave the traditional Jewish name for this entire story, the akedah, the binding, not the sacrifice, not the test, but the binding. That moment when Abraham took cords or rope and tied his son's hands and feet, restraining him, preventing escape or resistance, making him helpless on the altar. How old was Isaac? The text does not tell us directly, but the evidence suggests he was not a small child. He was old enough to carry substantial amounts of wood up a mountain, old enough to ask perceptive questions about the sacrifice, old enough to understand what was happening around him. Jewish tradition suggests he may have been anywhere from 13 to 37 years old, some rabbis even calculating he was the same age Jesus would be at his crucifixion. Abraham was old, well over 100 years. If Isaac was a teenager or a young man, he could have resisted. He could have run. He could have overpowered his elderly father and fled down the mountain. But the text records no struggle, no protest, no resistance. Isaac was bound and laid on the altar, and the silence of the narrative suggests something profound. Either Isaac was too young to understand and too weak to resist, or he was old enough to comprehend and willing to submit, trusting his father even when his father's actions seemed incomprehensible, participating in the sacrifice even as he was about to become it. If Isaac understood, if he willingly allowed himself to be bound, then the Akedah was not just a test of Abraham's faith, but a revelation of Isaac's faith as well. It was not just a father willing to sacrifice his son, but a son willing to be sacrificed. Not just Abraham's obedience, but Isaac's submission. Not just one man's faith tested, but a family's trust in God demonstrated even unto death. Abraham laid him on the altar on top of the wood. The son was positioned, ready for slaughter, placed where the fire would reach him, where the smoke would rise from his burning flesh, where his blood would soak into the wood and stone. The miracle child, the son of promise, the heir of the covenant, the one through whom all nations would be blessed, he lay bound and helpless, waiting for what came next. Then Abraham reached out his hand. The Hebrew emphasizes the deliberate nature of the action. V'yishlach Avraham et yado. Abraham stretched out his hand, extended his arm, moved toward the completion of the command. This was not a sudden, thoughtless motion, but a conscious, willed action, a choice made and executed, a step taken that could not be taken back, and took the knife, the ma'akaleth, the slaughtering knife, the blade used for killing animals for sacrifice, sharp enough to cut quickly, designed to end life efficiently. Abraham's hand closed around it, held it firm, prepared to use it. The knife that had slaughtered countless lambs, that had split the throats of goats and calves and bulls, was now ready to be used on his son, to slaughter his son. The Hebrew word is lishchot, to kill, to slaughter, to sacrifice. It's the technical term for killing a sacrificial animal, the professional language of worship and offering, the word that described what Abraham had done hundreds of times before, but never to his son, never to the child of promise, never to Isaac. Time seemed suspended in that moment. Abraham's hand was extended, the knife was raised, Isaac lay bound beneath him, and everything hung in the balance. All the promises, land, descendants, blessing to all nations, seemed about to die with the son who was their only hope of fulfillment. All the faith, decades of trusting God's word despite impossible circumstances, was being pushed to its absolute limit. All the love of a father for the son given in his old age after decades of barrenness, was being subordinated to obedience to God's command. What went through Abraham's mind in that moment? Did he see Isaac's face and remember the day he was born? the laughter that had filled the tent, the joy that had replaced despair? Did he think of Sarah and wonder how he would tell her what he had done, how he would return home without their son? Did he calculate one last time whether there might be another way, another interpretation, another option that would spare the boy? Or was his mind empty of everything except the command, filled with nothing but determination to obey, consumed by the will to complete what God had asked regardless of the cost, however unbearable? Did he consciously think God will raise him from the dead? Or did he simply move forward in faith so absolute that it needed no conscious reasoning, no internal dialogue, no justification beyond God said it, I must do it? The knife was poised. Abraham's arm was raised. The blade caught the sunlight. Isaac lay beneath him, bound and waiting. One motion, one thrust downward, one moment of following through, and it would be done. The son would be dead, the promise seemingly destroyed, the test completed. But just as the knife began its descent, a voice shattered the silence. "Abraham! Abraham!" It was the angel of the Lord calling from heaven, breaking into the moment with urgency marked by the doubled name. Not Abraham, but Abraham! Abraham! The repetition conveying the immediacy, the critical nature of the intervention, the necessity of stopping what was about to happen. Abraham's response was instant. "Here I am." The same words he had spoken when God first called him, when God first gave the command to sacrifice Isaac. The same availability, the same readiness, the same presence. He had been willing to complete the sacrifice. He was equally willing to stop it. His obedience was not to the act itself, but to the voice of God, whatever that voice commanded. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. The command was clear, emphatic, complete. Don't touch him. Don't harm him. Don't proceed. The knife that was raised must now be lowered. The sacrifice that was prepared must not be completed. The test had gone far enough. Then came the words that explained everything, that validated Abraham's faith, that revealed what God had seen in this terrible ordeal. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now I know. Not that God had been uncertain before. Omniscience does not require testing to discover what it already knows. But the test revealed to Abraham himself, revealed to Isaac, revealed to all who would later read this story, revealed in objective, demonstrable, undeniable fashion what had previously been internal and invisible. Abraham's faith was real. His fear of God was genuine. His obedience was complete. He had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that he loved God more than he loved the gift God had given, that he would obey even when obedience made no sense, that his trust in God exceeded his grip on the promise. You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. The phrase echoed the original command, your son, your only son, but now in the context of commendation rather than demand. Abraham had been willing to give what he loved most. He had held nothing back, kept no reservation, maintained no secret place where God's authority did not reach. Everything, even Isaac, even the child of promise, even the only means by which God's covenant could be fulfilled, everything belonged to God, and Abraham had proven he meant it. The knife was lowered. The immediate threat to Isaac's life passed. But Abraham's hand was still on the knife, his son still lay bound on the altar, and the question Isaac had asked remained, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. The provision was ready, had been ready, was waiting to be seen. Behind him, Abraham had to turn around, had to look away from Isaac, had to shift his attention from what he had been commanded to do to what God was providing instead. The ram was caught, trapped, unable to escape, providentially positioned and prepared. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. The substitution was explicit, tachat beno, in the place of his son, as a replacement for Isaac, dying in the stead of the one who'd been bound on the altar. The ram bore the knife that had been meant for Isaac. The ram's blood soaked into the wood instead of the boy's. The ram's body was consumed by the fire that would have burned the son. The ram died instead of Isaac, a substitute provided by God, a life given in exchange for a life spared. It was a principle established in flesh and blood on that mountain, the innocent dying for the guilty, the substitute bearing the penalty, one life offered in place of another. The ram could not have known it was enacting a drama that would define redemption, that would become the theological foundation for understanding how a just God could forgive sinful humanity, how mercy and justice could coexist, how love could satisfy righteousness through sacrifice. But there it was, caught in the thicket by its horns, dying in Isaac's place, provided by God at precisely the moment when provision was needed. Abraham called the name of that place "The Lord will provide," Yahweh Yireh. Not "the Lord has provided," past tense, looking backward at what had just happened, but "the Lord will provide," future tense, prophetic, pointing beyond this moment to provision still to come. What God had done on this mountain was not an isolated event, but a revelation of his character, a demonstration of what he would always do. Provide what was needed when it was needed, supply the sacrifice that righteousness required, furnish the means by which his people could approach him without being consumed. As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The saying entered common usage, became proverbial, was repeated by generation after generation of Israelites who looked back to this mountain and remembered what happened here. When they needed provision, they recalled Abraham's faith and God's faithfulness. When they brought their own sacrifices to the temple that would one day be built on this very mountain, they remembered that God had provided the first substitute here. When they trusted God in impossible circumstances, they echoed Abraham's words to Isaac, "God will provide." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. The test was complete, but God had more to say. Not just stop, but blessing. Not just enough, but commendation and covenant renewal. Not just relief, but reward for the faith that had been demonstrated so dramatically. "By myself I have sworn," declares the Lord, "because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." It was the promise repeated and amplified, sworn by God himself, since there was no one greater by whom to swear. The descendants would be multiplied, as numerous as the stars Abraham had been told to count decades earlier, as countless as the sand on the seashore stretching beyond sight. They would conquer their enemies, possess the gates of opposing cities, triumph in conflict. And through them, through Abraham's offspring, all nations on earth would be blessed. The singular word for offspring, zerah in Hebrew, could be read as plural or singular, could refer to Abraham's many descendants or to one specific descendant. Paul would later note this ambiguity in his letter to the Galatians, arguing that the promise pointed ultimately to Christ, the singular offspring through whom the blessing would come to all nations. But whether the promise was fulfilled through Israel collectively or through Christ specifically, the point was clear. Abraham's obedience on this mountain secured blessing not just for his family, but for the entire world. "Because you have obeyed my voice." The reason was explicit, not because Abraham was perfect. He had failed in Egypt, had struggled with faith, had tried to help God along by fathering Ishmael. Not because Isaac was worthy. He had done nothing to earn God's favour, had simply been born and grown and now had been spared, but because Abraham obeyed. When God spoke, Abraham listened. When God commanded, Abraham acted. When the command made no sense, when it seemed to contradict everything else God had revealed, when it cost more than seemed bearable, still Abraham obeyed. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. The narrative moves quickly past the descent from the mountain, giving us no dialogue between Abraham and Isaac, no words spoken between father and son after this ordeal, no processing of what had just happened. We are left to imagine the silence or the conversation, the relief or the trauma, the questions Isaac must have had and the answers Abraham may or may not have been able to give. Did they speak of it on the way down the mountain? Did Isaac ask why his father had been willing to kill him? Did Abraham explain about the test, about the voice of God, about the faith that required obedience even when obedience seemed to lead to destruction? Or did they walk in silence, each processing in his own way what had occurred on that mountain, what it meant about God and faith and obedience and trust? The text does not tell us. We know only that they returned to Beersheba together, that life continued after the test, that the household resumed its rhythms with the son still alive, the promise still intact, the covenant still in force. But something had changed on that mountain. Something had been revealed about the nature of faith, about the cost of obedience, about the character of God. Abraham had proven that he feared God more than he loved the gifts God gave. Isaac had learned, whether he understood it fully or not, that he was not ultimately his father's possession but God's, that his life belonged to the one who had given it, that he existed not for his own sake but for God's purposes, and God had demonstrated something that would echo through scripture and theology for millennia. He provides. When righteousness requires a sacrifice, he supplies it. When death seems inevitable, he makes a way of escape. When the knife is raised and judgment is about to fall, he intervenes with provision that spares the condemned and satisfies justice. The ram caught in the thicket by its horns died that day on Mount Moriah. Isaac lived. The covenant promise continued through the son who had been spared. And generations later, on or near this same mountain, in this same region, another son would carry wood up a hill for his own sacrifice. But that time there would be no voice from heaven stopping the execution. That time the knife would fall, the beloved son would die, and the father would not spare him. Because that son was not just the one being sacrificed, but also the sacrifice itself. Not just Isaac, but also the ram. Not just the condemned, but also the substitute. The altar on Moriah had been built and then it had been dismantled. The son had been bound and then released. The knife had been raised and then lowered. The ram had been provided and then offered. And the name Abraham gave the place, the Lord will provide, pointed beyond that day, beyond that mountain, beyond that test, to a provision still to come, to a sacrifice still to be offered, to a day when God would give what Abraham had only been asked to give, when the Father would not withhold his own Son, but would deliver him up for us all. The test was complete. The faith was proven. The obedience was demonstrated. And on the mountain of the Lord it was provided. Not just a ram for that moment, but a principle for all time. Not just rescue for Isaac, but a pattern for redemption. Not just an altar that was emptied, but a truth that was established. When God tests, he also provides. When he demands sacrifice, he supplies the substitute. When death seems certain, he makes a way for life. Abraham and Isaac descended the mountain together, father and son reunited, the test behind them, the covenant before them, the provision secured. The place would be remembered. The story would be told. And the truth revealed on Moriah would shine through the centuries, illuminating the cross where another father, another son, and another sacrifice would complete what was foreshadowed here on this mountain where God provided. The name Abraham gave to that place, Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide, became more than a memorial of what had happened on the mountain. It became a theological statement, a prophetic declaration, a truth that would resonate through the centuries and shape how God's people understood his character and his ways. The Lord will provide, not might provide, not sometimes provides, not provides only for the deserving. The Lord will provide. It was a certainty, a promise embedded in the very name of the place where the impossible had been demanded and the substitute had been supplied. The verb yireh comes from the Hebrew root rara, which means to see. Yahweh Yireh can be translated the Lord will see or the Lord will provide. And both meanings are intertwined because provision flows from God's seeing. He sees the need before we articulate it. He sees the crisis before we feel its full weight. He sees the solution before we imagine it possible. And because he sees, he provides. His provision is not reactive but proactive, not surprised but prepared, not scrambling but sovereign. Abraham learned on Moriah what he had been learning throughout his journey with God, that the Lord who calls is also the Lord who provides. that the God who tests is also the God who supplies, that the one who demands sacrifice is also the one who furnishes the substitute. It was a lesson written not in abstract theological propositions, but in lived experience, in the terror of the knife raised and the relief of the ram provided, in the agony of binding his son, and the joy of releasing him alive. But the provision on Moriah was not arbitrary or random. God did not simply decide on a whim to spare Isaac and supply a ram. The test itself had a purpose, and the provision revealed something essential about God's character that could not have been revealed any other way. God never intended for Isaac to die. The test was real. Abraham's willingness was genuinely required. His obedience was actually tested. The knife was truly raised. But God's intention from the beginning was to provide the substitute, to demonstrate that he himself would supply what he required, to show that sacrifice was necessary, but that he would be the one to furnish it. Abraham had to be willing to give Isaac. God had to show that he would provide the ram. Both truths were essential. The provision of the ram established a principle that would become central to Israel's understanding of how they could approach God, the principle of substitution. The guilty could be spared if the innocent died in their place. The condemned could go free if another bore their penalty. Justice could be satisfied, and mercy could be extended simultaneously through the mechanism of substitutionary sacrifice. This principle was not invented on Moriah, but it was dramatically demonstrated there in a way that made it undeniable and unforgettable. Adam and Eve, expelled from Eden, had been clothed in garments of skin, implying that an animal had died to cover their nakedness and shame. Abel's sacrifice had been accepted while Cain's was rejected, establishing that blood sacrifice had unique significance before God. The Passover, still centuries in the future, would require a lamb's blood on the doorpost so that the firstborn might be spared. The entire sacrificial system that would be established through Moses at Sinai would operate on this principle. Life for life, blood for blood, the innocent dying so the guilty could live. But Moriah made it personal in a way nothing had before. This was not a sheep for the shepherd's sin or a goat for the farmer's transgression. This was a son who should have died, spared by a ram God provided. The substitute was not found by Abraham or purchased in a market or selected from his own flocks. It was caught in a thicket, trapped and waiting, providentially placed by God at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. The provision was divine, the timing was perfect, and the message was clear. When God requires sacrifice, God provides the sacrifice. The covenant God renewed with Abraham after the test, sworn by God's own self because there was no one greater to swear by, took on new dimensions in light of what had just occurred. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. The promise was not new, but its confirmation came with new weight, new certainty, new connection to Abraham's demonstrated faith. The blessing was no longer conditioned on Abraham's waiting or Sarah's conceiving, or even Isaac's survival. It was anchored in God's oath, sworn by his own character, made certain by divine commitment that transcended human faithfulness. Abraham had proven he would hold nothing back from God. God had proven he would hold nothing back from Abraham. The relationship was established on the firmest possible foundation, mutual commitment demonstrated through the costliest possible test. Your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. The promise now included victory, conquest, dominance over opposition. The seed of Abraham would not merely survive but thrive, would not merely exist but prevail, would not merely occupy space but control strategic positions. To possess the gate of a city was to control access, to determine who entered and who was excluded, to exercise authority over the entire population. Abraham's descendants would have such power over their adversaries. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. The universal scope of the blessing remained at the centre of God's purpose for Abraham. This was never just about one man or one family or even one nation. Through Abraham's seed, all the families of the earth, every tribe, every tongue, every people group in every generation would receive blessing. The promise stretched beyond Israel to encompass humanity. beyond time to encompass eternity, beyond national advantage to encompass cosmic redemption. The word offspring or seed, zera, appeared in singular form, allowing for both collective and individual interpretation. Abraham's many descendants would be a channel of blessing, but also one specific descendant would be the ultimate fulfillment, the one through whom the blessing would definitively come to all nations. Paul would later argue in his letter to the Galatians that this singular seed referred ultimately to Christ, that all the promises to Abraham found their yes and amen in Jesus, that the blessing to all nations came through the gospel that descended from Abraham's line. But even without the New Testament's clarification, the connection between the substitute ram on Moriah and the promised blessing to all nations was suggestive. If the ram died so Isaac could live, and if through Isaac's offspring all nations would be blessed, then perhaps the blessing to all nations would also come through some kind of substitutionary sacrifice, through an innocent one dying so the guilty could live, through blood shed so life could be given. The principle of substitution established on Moriah became the organizing logic of Israel's entire sacrificial system. When the law came through Moses, it specified in elaborate detail how sacrifices should be offered, what animals were acceptable, how blood should be handled, what rituals should be performed. But underneath all the specific regulations was the basic principle. The sinner deserved death, but an innocent substitute could die in their place, bearing their guilt, satisfying justice, making atonement. The Hebrew word for atonement, kafar, meant to cover, to make reconciliation, to purge or cleanse. The blood of the sacrifice covered the sin, made reconciliation between the offender and God, cleansed the defilement that separated humanity from holiness. The sacrifices did not eliminate sin. Hebrews would later make clear they were only shadows, annual reminders of sin rather than permanent solutions. But they demonstrated the principle and pointed toward the ultimate sacrifice that would actually accomplish what they symbolized. Every Passover lamb slaughtered to protect the firstborn was an echo of the ram on Moriah. Every day of atonement sacrifice, when the high priest entered the most holy place with blood to make atonement for the nation's sins, was a repetition of the principle established when Abraham raised the knife and God provided the substitute. Every burnt offering, peace offering, sin offering, and guilt offering carried within it the truth that Moriah had revealed. God provides the sacrifice that God requires. Abraham understood, at least in part, what had been revealed on that mountain. When Isaac had asked, "Where is the lamb?" Abraham had answered prophetically, "God will provide for himself the lamb, my son." The statement had multiple layers of meaning. God would provide the lamb for this specific sacrifice, and he had, in the form of the ram. God would provide the lamb for himself, not for Abraham's benefit primarily, but to satisfy his own righteousness, to fulfill his own purposes, to accomplish his own plan. And perhaps most profoundly, God would provide himself as the lamb, would one day supply not just a substitute from creation, but would himself become the sacrifice, would enter his own creation to die the death that justice required. Abraham could not have fully understood all these dimensions. He stood too early in the unfolding story, too far from the cross to see clearly how all the pieces would fit together, but he knew enough. He knew that the God who provided the ram on Moriah could be trusted to provide whatever was needed whenever it was needed. He knew that the God who had tested him loved him and had purposes beyond what he could comprehend. He knew that faith meant trusting God even when obedience made no sense, and that such faith was rewarded with provision that exceeded expectation. The faith that Abraham demonstrated on Moriah was not blind faith, faith that ignored evidence or rejected reason. It was tested faith, faith that had been built over decades of walking with God, faith that had seen promise fulfilled in Isaac's birth after years of impossibility, faith that reasoned if God could give life to a dead womb, he could give life to a dead body, faith that believed God's character was trustworthy even when God's commands seemed contradictory. The writer of Hebrews would later reflect on Abraham's faith and provide insight into his thinking. He considered that God was able even to raise the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham believed in resurrection, not as abstract theology but as practical confidence in God's power. If God required Isaac's death, and yet had promised that through Isaac the covenant would continue, then God must be able to raise Isaac from the dead. The logic was inexorable. Promise plus command equals resurrection. God cannot lie, God cannot fail. Therefore, if he commands Isaac's death while promising Isaac's offspring, he must have a way to bring Isaac back to life. In this sense, Abraham did receive Isaac back from the dead figuratively. When the knife was raised and Isaac lay bound, he was as good as dead. The sacrifice was inevitable. The obedience was complete. The death was certain. But God intervened. The substitute was provided, and Isaac lived. It was a resurrection of sorts, not from actual death, but from certain death, not from the grave, but from the altar, not biological restoration, but covenantal rescue. This faith that God could and would raise the dead became foundational for everything that followed. The entire biblical narrative from this point forward assumed that death was not the final word, that God's purposes could not be thwarted by mortality, that resurrection was within God's power and part of his plan. Job would declare, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." The prophets would speak of resurrection. Jesus would perform resurrections and predict his own. Paul would argue that if there is no resurrection, faith is futile, and the entire Christian hope would rest on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead as the guarantee of a resurrection for all who believe. But it began here, on Mount Moriah, with Abraham reasoning that if God required his son's death, and yet had promised that through his son the nations would be blessed, then God must be able to raise the dead. The faith that believed this led to obedience that was willing to go all the way to death, and that obedience was met with provision that spared the son and supplied the substitute. The God who provides was also the God who tests. The provision did not come without the test. The ram did not appear until the knife was raised. The voice from heaven did not call out until Abraham's hand was extended toward his son. The rescue came at the last possible moment, not before the test, but after it was complete, not instead of obedience, but through obedience carried to its fullest extent. This pattern would repeat throughout Scripture and throughout the experience of God's people. Provision comes, but often at the last moment. Rescue arrives, but usually after faith has been tested to its limits. The way opens, but typically only after we have committed fully to walking forward even when no way is visible. God provides, but he provides in ways that require faith, in timing that tests trust, through means that highlight his sovereignty rather than our planning. The ram caught in the thicket did not appear at the base of the mountain when they first arrived. It was not visible during the 3-day journey or waiting at Beersheba before they left. It appeared, or rather, Abraham saw it, only after he had built the altar, arranged the wood, bound Isaac, and raised the knife. The provision was there when it was needed, not before it seemed needed. God's timing is not our timing, but it is always perfect, always sufficient, always exactly what faith requires to be strengthened rather than what fear demands to be comforted. Abraham descended from Moriah with Isaac alive, the covenant confirmed, the blessing pronounced, and his faith proven beyond any doubt. The test was behind him, but its lessons would last forever. He had learned in the most visceral way possible that the Lord provides, that faith requires obedience even when understanding fails, that God's commands can be trusted even when they seem to contradict his promises, that the God who tests is also the God who supplies. The place name remained, Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. It became proverbial, a saying repeated whenever provision was needed, a memory invoked whenever faith was tested, a truth declared whenever circumstances seemed impossible. On the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Not might be provided, not sometimes provided, but will be provided. Certainly, definitely guaranteed by the character of the God who proved himself faithful on that mountain. And in the centuries that followed, when the temple was built on or near that same mountain, when sacrifices were offered daily on altars in that same region, when the Passover lamb was slaughtered, and the Day of Atonement rituals were performed and the priests entered the holy place with blood to make atonement. All of it pointed back to Moriah, to the ram in the thicket, to the principle of substitution, to the God who provides. The blessing to all nations was secure, anchored in God's oath, demonstrated through Abraham's faith, connected to the provision of a substitute. The promise would unfold through Isaac's line, through Jacob and his 12 sons, through Israel as a nation, through David's throne and Solomon's wisdom and the prophets' proclamations, and ultimately, on a hill near the Temple Mount, in the region of Moriah, another sacrifice would be offered, another son would die, and the blessing to all nations would come through the provision of the ultimate substitute, the Lamb of God who would take away the sin of the world. But for Abraham and Isaac, descending the mountain that day with the ram's ashes still warm on the altar behind them, the immediate reality was simpler and more personal. God had tested, they had obeyed, provision had come, and life continued. The God who provides had proven faithful. The faith that trusted was vindicated, and the covenant that promised was secured by divine oath, guaranteed by demonstrated character, confirmed through the costliest test imaginable. The Lord will provide. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The name Abraham gave that place echoed through the centuries, proclaimed a truth that each generation would need to learn for themselves, that the God who tests is the God who supplies, that obedience opens the door to provision, that faith carried to its limits discovers resources beyond imagination, and that the God who requires sacrifice is the God who provides the substitute. The lesson of Moriah was complete, the test was finished, the provision was supplied, and the truth revealed on that mountain would shine through all the subsequent revelation, illuminating the cross where God would provide what he had only asked Abraham to provide, where the Father would not spare his Son but would give him up for us all, where the ultimate substitute would die so that all who believe might live, and where the blessing to all nations promised to Abraham would finally and fully and forever be accomplished through the offspring who was also the sacrifice, the Son who was also the Lamb, the provision that God himself supplied. The parallels between what happened on Mount Moriah and what would happen nearly 2,000 years later on a hill called Golgotha are too numerous, too specific, too profound to be coincidental. The story of Abraham and Isaac was not merely a historical event or a test of faith. It was a prophetic drama, a living parable, a shadow cast backward in time from the cross where God would do what he had only asked Abraham to be willing to do. A beloved son. The language God used when commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, your son, your only son whom you love, finds its echo in the language of the Gospels. At Jesus' baptism, the voice from heaven declared, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." The Father had a beloved Son, and that Son would be given as a sacrifice, not in a test that would be stopped at the last moment, but in an execution that would be carried through to completion. Isaac was Abraham's only son in the sense that mattered, the only son of the covenant, the only son through Sarah, the only son through whom the promises would be fulfilled. Ishmael existed, but he had been sent away, excluded from the line of promise. Jesus was God's only son in an absolute sense, monogenes, the only begotten, unique, without parallel or peer. Both fathers had only one son who mattered for the purposes of redemption, only one son through whom the promises and purposes would be accomplished. And both sons were loved. The command to Abraham emphasized Isaac's belovedness, whom you love, making the sacrifice more costly, the obedience more difficult, the test more severe. The Father's love for the Son was declared at the baptism, at the transfiguration, throughout the Gospel narratives. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. The giving was costly precisely because of the love, the sacrifice meaningful because of the relationship, the act of redemption profound because it involved the Father surrendering what he loved most, the Son carrying the wood. Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice at Mount Moriah. Jesus carried the cross, the wooden instrument of his execution, up the hill to Golgotha. The image is haunting in its symmetry. The Son bearing on his own shoulders the means of his death, the instrument of sacrifice carried by the one who would be sacrificed. In both cases the burden was heavy, the destination was a mountain, and the Father accompanied the Son knowing what awaited at the top, the voluntary submission. If Isaac was old enough to understand and strong enough to resist, and the evidence suggests he was a young man, not a small child, then his willingness to be bound represents voluntary submission to his father's will. He could have run, he could have fought, he could have refused, but he allowed himself to be bound and laid on the altar, trusting his father even when his father's actions made no sense. Jesus' submission was explicit and complete. "Not my will, but yours, be done." He prayed in Gethsemane. "No one takes my life from me," he told his disciples, "but I lay it down of my own accord." When Peter drew a sword to defend him, Jesus rebuked him. "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" The crucifixion was not something that happened to Jesus against his will, but something he voluntarily accepted in obedience to the Father, just as Isaac accepted being bound in obedience to Abraham. The 3-day journey. Abraham travelled for 3 days to reach Mount Moriah. During those 3 days, Isaac was as good as dead. The command had been given, the obedience was certain, and the sacrifice would be completed unless God intervened. In a symbolic sense, Isaac was dead for 3 days and then restored to life when the ram was provided. Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days, literally dead, genuinely deceased, actually experiencing the separation from life that sin brings, and then raised on the 3rd day. The pattern of 3 days leading to resurrection appears in both narratives, connecting the figurative death and restoration of Isaac to the literal death and resurrection of Christ. The location. Mount Moriah was in the region that would become Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles explicitly identifies Moriah as the site where Solomon built the temple. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. The Temple Mount, where sacrifices would be offered for centuries, where the blood of countless lambs and bulls and goats would be shed to make atonement for sin, where the Day of Atonement rituals would annually dramatize the need for substitutionary sacrifice. All of this happened on the mountain where Abraham had been willing to sacrifice Isaac and where God had provided the ram. And just outside the city walls, across a small valley from the Temple Mount, stood a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, where criminals were executed and where Jesus was crucified. The geographical proximity was not accidental. The place where God provided the substitute for Isaac was in the same region, where God would provide his own son as the substitute for humanity. The mountain where the principle of substitution was dramatically established became the centre of a sacrificial system that would operate for over 1,000 years, all of it pointing toward the ultimate sacrifice that would occur nearby, the willing Father. Abraham raised the knife, willing to complete the sacrifice, to kill his own son in obedience to God's command. The cost was unimaginable. This was the son given after decades of barrenness, the miracle child, the heir of all the promises. Yet Abraham was prepared to do it, had committed to do it, would have done it if God had not intervened. His willingness demonstrated love for God that exceeded even the love for his son. God the Father went further. He actually did what Abraham was only asked to be willing to do. He actually gave his son. He actually allowed the sacrifice to proceed to completion. There was no voice from heaven calling, "Stop." No ram caught in a thicket to die instead. No last-minute provision of a substitute. Jesus was the substitute, and there was no one to substitute for him. Abraham raised the knife but did not bring it down. God raised his son on a cross and did not spare him. The Father's willingness to sacrifice the Son was proven not in intention, but in execution, not in preparation, but in completion, not in symbolic gesture, but in actual death, the substitute provided. The ram caught in the thicket died in Isaac's place, an innocent animal bearing the penalty that should have fallen on the Son, a life given so another life could be spared. Jesus was both the Son who should have been spared and the Lamb who died in our place. He was Isaac and the ram simultaneously, the beloved Son and the substitutionary sacrifice, the one who deserved life and the one who gave his life for others. John the Baptist saw it when Jesus came to be baptized. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Not a lamb, one among many, but the Lamb, the ultimate fulfillment of every substitutionary sacrifice, the reality to which all the shadows pointed, the provision God had been preparing since the foundation of the world. Every Passover lamb slaughtered, every ram offered, every bull or goat whose blood was shed, all of them pointed forward to this lamb, this final sacrifice, this provision that would accomplish what the others could only symbolize. Paul captured the connection explicitly in Romans. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? The language echoes Genesis 22, did not spare, gave him up, but with the crucial difference that God did not spare his son as he had spared Isaac. Abraham did not withhold his son, God did not spare his. The parallel language connects the two events while highlighting the decisive difference. The test given to Abraham was completed by God himself. The New Testament writers saw in Abraham's experience on Mount Moriah not just an inspiring story of faith, but a prophetic picture of the gospel. Hebrews includes Abraham in the catalogue of faith heroes, noting that he considered that God was able even to raise the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. The resurrection of Jesus made literal what had been figurative with Isaac. Death overcome, the Son restored to the Father, life emerging from what seemed like certain death. James references Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as the ultimate proof that his faith was genuine. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. The faith that believed God's promise was proven genuine by the obedience that was willing to sacrifice the fulfillment of that promise. Faith and works were not opposed, but united, the one demonstrating the reality of the other. Jesus himself made the connection between Abraham's experience and his own mission. In his confrontation with the Jewish leaders recorded in John 8, Jesus declared, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." The leaders objected, "You're not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Missing the point entirely. Jesus was not claiming to have met Abraham personally, but declaring that Abraham, in his experience on Mount Moriah, had seen prophetically what Jesus would accomplish, had understood through the provision of the ram something of God's plan to provide the ultimate sacrifice, had rejoiced in the revelation of redemption that would come through his offspring. How did Abraham see Jesus' day? Perhaps through the prophetic dimensions of his own words to Isaac. God will provide for himself the lamb. The double meaning, God providing the lamb, God providing himself as the lamb, may have dawned on Abraham in some measure as he reflected on what had happened on that mountain. Perhaps through the covenant promise that through his offspring all nations would be blessed, a promise whose scope exceeded anything that could be accomplished through natural descendants alone. Perhaps through the ram provided at the last moment, a substitute that saved Isaac, but pointed toward a greater substitution still to come. The writer of Hebrews makes another crucial observation about Abraham's faith that connects to the resurrection of Christ. He considered that God was able even to raise the dead. Abraham's confidence that God could raise Isaac from death was not abstract theology, but lived faith. Faith tested in the furnace of actual obedience. When Jesus was raised from the dead on the third day, he vindicated Abraham's faith in resurrection, proved that the God who could give life to a barren womb could also give life to a dead body, demonstrated that death was not the final word, and that God's promises would be fulfilled no matter what obstacles, even mortality itself, stood in the way. But here is where the parallel between Isaac and Jesus reaches its most profound difference. Isaac did not actually die. Abraham was willing, the knife was raised, but the voice from heaven stopped the sacrifice before it was completed. Isaac walked down the mountain alive, the test fulfilled without the death occurring. Jesus actually died. The nails were driven in, the spear pierced his side, the breath left his body, and he was laid in a tomb. The sacrifice was completed, the blood was shed, the death was real and total and final, until the third day when resurrection transformed death into life. In this difference lies the heart of the gospel. Isaac's story demonstrated that God requires sacrifice and provides a substitute. Jesus' story accomplished what Isaac's story foreshadowed, that God himself would be both the one requiring sacrifice and the one providing it, both the Father giving the Son and the Son giving himself, both the offended party demanding satisfaction for sin and the merciful Saviour satisfying that demand through self-sacrifice. The ram caught in the thicket died in Isaac's place, but could not die in humanity's place. The blood of animals, as Hebrews makes clear, could never actually take away sins. It could only cover them temporarily, point toward the need for a better sacrifice, maintain the system until the reality arrived. Jesus died once for all, the just for the unjust, to bring us to God. His sacrifice was sufficient not because it was offered, but because of who offered it. God himself in human flesh, the sinless one bearing the sins of the world, the infinite one whose death could cover infinite guilt. The prophetic nature of Abraham's experience on Moriah becomes clearer when we see how comprehensively it anticipates the cross. The beloved Son, the willing submission, the wood carried, the 3 days, the location, the substitute provided, the Father's willingness, the resurrection on the 3rd day, all of it points forward with remarkable specificity to what would happen when God completed what he had asked Abraham only to be willing to do. Paul's language in Romans 8 deserves fuller exploration. He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all. The Greek word translated spare is pheidomai, to refrain from, to hold back, to be lenient with, to protect from harm. God did not spare his Son. He did not hold him back. He did not protect him from harm. He gave him up, peredoken, handed him over, delivered him up, surrendered him to death. The language deliberately echoes Genesis 22, where Abraham did not withhold his son, his only son. But while Abraham's willingness was tested and proven without the actual death occurring, God's willingness resulted in actual sacrifice, actual death, actual bloodshed. The test given to Abraham revealed what God himself would do. The drama enacted on Mount Moriah previewed the drama enacted on Golgotha. The story of the Father and Son on the mountain pointed toward the story of the Father and Son on the cross. The blessing to all nations that was promised to Abraham, "In your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed," found its ultimate fulfillment not in the biological descendants of Abraham, but in the one descendant who would bring blessing not through military conquest or political power, but through substitutionary death. Jesus is the offspring through whom the blessing comes. His death and resurrection open the way for people from every nation, tribe, tongue, and people to be reconciled to God, to receive forgiveness of sins, to become children of Abraham by faith. Peter made this connection explicit in his sermon in Acts 3. "You are the sons of the prophets, and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, 'And in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed.' God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first, to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness." The blessing promised to Abraham was the gospel, the good news that through Jesus Christ, Abraham's descendant, salvation had come to all who believe. The New Testament writers saw Mount Moriah not as ancient history disconnected from their present, but as prophetic revelation preparing for the gospel. When they proclaimed that Christ died for our sins, they were proclaiming the fulfillment of what had been foreshadowed on that mountain. When they declared that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, they were announcing that God had done what he asked Abraham to be willing to do. When they testified to resurrection on the 3rd day, they were confirming what Abraham had believed, that God could raise the dead and that his promises would be fulfilled despite even death itself. The cross was not Plan B, not God's response to an unexpected crisis, not a last-minute adjustment to human rebellion. It was Plan A, ordained before the foundation of the world, foreshadowed throughout Old Testament history, specifically previewed on Mount Moriah when God tested Abraham's faith and revealed his own intention to provide the sacrifice that he required. Isaac walked down the mountain alive because a ram died in his place. Humanity can walk out of the shadow of death because Jesus died in our place. The principle is the same. The scale is different. The substitute on Moriah saved one life for one day. The substitute on Calvary saves all who believe for all eternity. The ram was caught in the thicket by its horns. Jesus was nailed to a cross by human hands carrying out divine plan. Both died as substitutes, but only one died as the ultimate and final substitute, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, the provision that God himself supplied to accomplish what all the other sacrifices could only symbolize. Mount Moriah pointed to Mount Calvary. The willing Father on Moriah previewed the willing Father at Calvary. The obedient Son on Moriah foreshadowed the obedient Son at Calvary. The substitute ram on Moriah anticipated the Lamb of God at Calvary, and the resurrection of Isaac, figurative though it was, pointed toward the resurrection of Jesus, which was literal, bodily, historical, and the foundation of Christian hope. When Abraham named that place "the Lord will provide," he spoke more prophetically than he could have known. God would provide, not just the ram for Isaac, but the lamb for the world. God would provide, not just temporal rescue for one family, but eternal salvation for all who believe. God would provide, and ultimately, shockingly, gloriously, God would provide himself, would enter his own creation as the substitute sacrifice, would become both the priest and the offering, both the one demanding justice and the one satisfying it. The shadows of Mount Moriah stretched across the centuries to Calvary, where the reality emerged in full light. The test that Abraham passed pointed to the sacrifice that God completed. The faith that believed God could raise the dead was vindicated when Jesus rose from the tomb, and the blessing to all nations promised to Abraham flows to all who trust in Jesus Christ. The ultimate offspring, the final sacrifice, the provision that God himself supplied to accomplish redemption that no human effort could achieve and that only divine love would attempt. Abraham descended from Mount Moriah a changed man, though the text does not elaborate on how the experience transformed him. The knife had been raised and lowered. The son had been bound and released. The ram had been provided and offered. And in those moments on the mountain, something had been forged in Abraham's soul that would define him for the rest of his life and for all of history. He became known forever as the father of faith, the man who trusted God even when trust meant surrendering what he loved most. The designation was not accidental or arbitrary. Throughout Scripture, whenever faith needs to be illustrated, whenever trust in God needs an example, whenever obedience in the face of impossibility requires a model, Abraham appears. He became the paradigm, the standard, the reference point against which all subsequent faith would be measured. Not because he was perfect. The biblical narrative is honest about his failures, his deceptions, his attempts to help God along through human scheming. But because when the ultimate test came, when everything was on the line, when God asked for what seemed to contradict every promise he had made, Abraham said yes. The test on Moriah was not the beginning of Abraham's faith journey. That had started decades earlier when he left Ur in response to God's call. It was not even the first time he had trusted God against impossible odds. He had believed the promise of a son when both he and Sarah were too old for conception. But Moriah was the culmination, the apex, the moment when faith was tested to its absolute breaking point and did not break. It was one thing to believe God could do the impossible. It was another thing entirely to obey God when obedience seemed to guarantee the destruction of everything he had promised. The story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah raises uncomfortable questions that every generation must wrestle with. How could a good God command such a thing? How could requiring a father to sacrifice his son ever be considered a test of faith rather than an act of moral horror? The question is not new. Readers have struggled with it for thousands of years, and the struggle itself is important because it forces us to confront the nature of faith, the character of God, and the meaning of obedience. Several truths must be held in tension when considering this story. First, God never intended for Isaac to die. The test was real. Abraham's willingness was genuinely required. But the outcome was never in doubt from God's perspective. He knew he would provide the ram. He knew he would stop Abraham's hand. He knew Isaac would walk down the mountain alive. The test revealed Abraham's heart, not God's intention. Second, this was a unique historical moment, not a template for normal religious practice. The Torah explicitly and repeatedly forbids child sacrifice, condemning it as an abomination practiced by pagan nations that Israel must never imitate. God was not endorsing child sacrifice through this command to Abraham. He was establishing the principle that he himself would provide the substitute sacrifice, that human sacrifice was unnecessary because God would supply what righteousness required. Every other religion in the ancient Near East demanded child sacrifice as the ultimate expression of devotion. The God of Abraham demonstrated on Moriah that he did not want such sacrifices. He wanted trust, and he would provide the lamb. Third, the story only makes sense in light of resurrection faith. Abraham obeyed because he believed God could raise the dead, because he trusted that the promises through Isaac would be fulfilled even if Isaac died, because his faith had grown to the point where he knew that death itself could not thwart God's purposes. This was not blind obedience to a capricious deity, but reasoned trust in a faithful God whose character had been proven over decades of relationship. Yet even with these clarifications, the story retains its unsettling power. It was meant to unsettle, meant to push us beyond comfortable categories, meant to confront us with the question, what are we holding on to that we need to surrender? What do we love that we love more than God? What has become so central to our lives that we cannot imagine obeying God if obedience meant losing it? For Abraham, it was Isaac, the son given after decades of waiting, the miracle child, the fulfillment of promise, the heir of everything. Isaac had become not just beloved but central, not just cherished, but potentially idolatrous. Did Abraham love the gift more than the giver? Did he trust the promise more than the promise maker? Would he obey God even if it meant surrendering the very thing God had given him? The test on Moriah forced Abraham to answer those questions not in theory but in practice, not in comfortable theological discussion, but with a knife in his hand and his son on the altar. And his answer was yes. Yes, he loved God more than Isaac. Yes, he trusted God more than the promise. Yes, he would obey, even when obedience seemed to contradict everything he believed about God's character and purposes. This radical surrender, this willingness to hold everything with an open hand, this commitment to obey God regardless of cost, this became the defining characteristic of biblical faith. Not merely believing that God exists, not simply affirming correct doctrines, not even trusting God to keep his promises, but obeying God even when obedience makes no sense, when it costs everything, when it seems to destroy the very things God has promised. James, the brother of Jesus, captured this dimension of Abraham's faith when he wrote, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works." Faith and works were not opposed, but united in Abraham's experience. He believed God. That was faith. He obeyed God even to the point of raising the knife over his son. That was works flowing from faith. Faith proving itself genuine through obedience, belief demonstrated in action. This integration of faith and works, of trust and obedience, of believing and doing, became the model for what genuine faith looks like. Faith that does not produce obedience is not biblical faith, but merely intellectual assent. Faith that does not cost anything has not been tested. Faith that holds back, that maintains reservations, that keeps certain areas of life off limits to God's authority. Such faith has not yet matured into the kind of faith Abraham demonstrated on Moriah. But Abraham's legacy was not just about his faith. It was about what that faith accomplished. Through Isaac, the son who was spared, came Jacob. Through Jacob came the 12 tribes of Israel. Through Israel came the prophets who spoke God's word, the kings who foreshadowed the Messiah, the priests who maintained the sacrificial system that pointed toward ultimate redemption. Through Israel came Jesus, the descendant of Abraham in whom all the promises found their yes and amen, through whom the blessing to all nations became reality. The blessing to all nations, that promise given to Abraham and reaffirmed on Mount Moriah, has echoed through history with increasing fulfillment. Through the Jewish people came the Scriptures, the revelation of the one true God in a world filled with idols and false deities. Through Jewish prophets came the proclamation of justice, mercy, and righteousness that shaped moral consciousness across cultures. Through Jewish apostles came the gospel, the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ that has spread to every corner of the globe. Today, more than 2 billion people identify as Christians, followers of Jesus Christ who was a descendant of Abraham. Beyond Christianity, Islam and Judaism both claim Abraham as their spiritual father, making him arguably the most influential figure in human religious history. The promise that through his offspring all nations would be blessed has been fulfilled in ways that exceed anything Abraham could have imagined when he first left Ur, when he first believed the promise of a son, when he raised the knife on Mount Moriah. But the deepest fulfillment of that blessing is not measured in numbers or influence, but in the reality of redemption accomplished through Jesus Christ. Paul explained to the Galatians that the gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham. In you shall all the nations be blessed. And then he made the connection explicit. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles. The blessing was never meant to be contained within one ethnic group or limited to biological descendants. It was always intended to reach all peoples through faith in the one descendant, Jesus Christ, who accomplished redemption that no human effort could achieve. This means that everyone who trusts in Jesus becomes a child of Abraham by faith, an heir of the promise, a participant in the blessing. Jews and Gentiles, slave and free, male and female, all who believe are Abraham's offspring in the way that matters most, united not by genetics but by faith, family not by blood but by the blood of Christ shed on Calvary, descendants of Abraham through the one true offspring who brought blessing to all nations. The Jewish tradition has preserved the story of the Akedah, the binding, as central to Jewish identity and worship. It is read every year on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, reminding the people of Abraham's faithfulness and God's provision. Jewish liturgy appeals to the merit of the Akedah, asking God to remember Abraham's obedience and to show mercy to his descendants. The ram's horn, the shofar, blown on high, Holy Days recalls the ram caught in the thicket, the substitute provided on Mount Moriah. For Jews, the Akedah represents ultimate devotion to God, the willingness to surrender everything in obedience to divine command, and the confidence that God will provide what he requires. It is a story of test and triumph, of near tragedy averted by divine intervention, of faith proven genuine through costly obedience. The fact that Isaac was spared demonstrates God's mercy. The fact that Abraham was willing demonstrates the depth of faith required of those who would follow the God of Abraham. Islamic tradition also reveres this story, though with a significant difference. Most Muslims identify the son to be sacrificed as Ishmael rather than Isaac. The Quran tells the story without naming the son, and early Islamic commentators were divided on his identity, though the majority tradition eventually identified him as Ishmael. Muslims commemorate this event during Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, when animals are slaughtered to remember Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son and God's provision of the ram. The core themes remain similar: faith, obedience, sacrifice, and divine provision. Christian interpretation has always seen the story primarily through the lens of Christ, as this entire narrative has explored. For Christians, Mount Moriah points to Calvary, Isaac foreshadows Jesus, and the ram anticipates the Lamb of God. The story is not just about Abraham's faith, but about God's plan, not just historical event, but prophetic revelation, not just test, but preview of the gospel. Every detail, the beloved son, the wood carried, the third day, the substitute provided, speaks of Christ and his sacrifice on behalf of sinners. But beyond the specific theological interpretations of different traditions, the story speaks universally about the nature of faith and what it means to trust God completely. Several enduring lessons emerge from Abraham's experience on Mount Moriah that transcend cultural and religious boundaries. First, true faith often requires us to surrender what we love most. We all have our Isaacs, the things we hold so tightly, the gifts we love so much, the blessings we cannot imagine living without. It might be a relationship, a career, a dream, a possession, a comfort, a reputation. God's call to radical surrender is not about destroying our joy, but about ensuring that nothing displaces him as the center of our lives that we love nothing more than we love him, that we are willing to obey even when obedience might cost us everything. Second, obedience often precedes understanding. Abraham obeyed before he understood how God would fulfill the promise through Isaac if Isaac died. He acted in faith before he had all the answers, before he could see how the pieces would fit together, before the resolution was clear. Faith means trusting God's character enough to obey his commands even when we cannot comprehend his purposes, believing that he is good and wise and faithful even when his ways seem mysterious or even contradictory. Third, God provides what God requires. Abraham told Isaac that God would provide the lamb, and God did. When God calls us to obedience that seems to require resources we do not have, he supplies what is needed. When he asks us to give what we cannot bear to surrender, he provides the grace to let go. When he commands what seems impossible, he enables what he requires. Provision follows obedience, not the other way around. The ram appeared after Abraham raised the knife, not before he climbed the mountain. Fourth, testing reveals and strengthens faith. Abraham's faith before Moriah was real, but his faith after Moriah was proven. The test did not create his faith, but revealed its depth, refined its purity, demonstrated its genuineness. God tests not to discover what he does not know, but to reveal what we need to see, to strengthen what he has planted, to refine what he intends to use. The testing of faith produces endurance, and endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope that does not disappoint. Fifth, resurrection hope changes everything. Abraham obeyed because he believed God could raise the dead. This hope transformed the test from tragedy to triumph, from senseless loss to temporary sacrifice, from the end of promise to a momentary obstacle that God could overcome. Resurrection hope, the confidence that death is not final, that God can bring life from death, that his purposes cannot be thwarted by mortality. This hope enables faith to endure what would otherwise be unbearable. The practical application of Abraham's story is both challenging and comforting. Challenging because it confronts us with the question, what are we unwilling to surrender to God? What have we placed off limits to his authority? What do we love so much that we could not obey God if obedience meant losing it? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones if we want faith that is genuine rather than merely theoretical. Comforting because the story reveals that God is not a cruel taskmaster, demanding sacrifices for his own gratification, but a loving Father who tests in order to refine, who requires surrender in order to give more abundantly, who asks for what we clutch so we can receive what he wants to give. Abraham surrendered Isaac and received him back, but more than that, he received a deeper relationship with God, a proven faith, a confirmed covenant, and the certainty that God would provide. The legacy of Abraham's faith extends beyond religious tradition into the realm of personal transformation. Countless believers across centuries have faced their own Mount Moriah moments, times when God asked them to surrender what they loved most, to trust him beyond what made sense, to obey when obedience seemed to guarantee loss. Missionaries who left comfortable homes to serve in dangerous places, parents who released their children to follow God's call even when it meant separation, martyrs who refused to deny Christ even when denial would have saved their lives, ordinary believers who surrendered dreams, relationships, security, comfort, whatever God asked, because they had learned what Abraham learned, that God is trustworthy, that obedience leads to blessing even when the path goes through surrender, that resurrection hope makes it possible to let go because we trust that God can restore what is released to him. The mountain remains, not the physical mountain. Though tourists and pilgrims still visit the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and imagine Abraham's altar somewhere on that sacred ridge. But the spiritual mountain, the place where faith is tested and proven, where surrender is required and provision is discovered, where the knife is raised and the voice from heaven calls enough, where substitutes are provided and sons are spared, this mountain each believer must climb in their own time, in their own circumstances, with their own Isaac on their own altar. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac ended with Isaac alive, the covenant confirmed, and faith proven. God's actual sacrifice of Jesus ended with Jesus raised from the dead, humanity redeemed, and blessing flowing to all nations. The test given to Abraham revealed what God himself would do. The faith demonstrated by Abraham pointed toward the faith required to receive what God has done. On the mount of the Lord it will be provided. The saying that emerged from Abraham's experience became a proclamation of hope for all who would trust God in impossible circumstances. It was provided on Moriah when the ram appeared. It was provided on Calvary when Jesus died. And it continues to be provided in the lives of all who follow in Abraham's footsteps, who trust when trust seems impossible, who obey when obedience seems unbearable, who surrender what they love because they love God more. The legacy of faith that Abraham established on Mount Moriah continues to this day. Every believer who trusts God in crisis stands on that mountain. Every parent who dedicates a child to God's purposes climbs that slope. Every person who surrenders control and trusts divine providence raises the knife of submission. And everyone who experiences God's provision, sometimes through circumstances changed, sometimes through grace to endure, sometimes through resurrection, hope that transforms tragedy, discovers what Abraham discovered: the Lord provides. Abraham died at the age of 175, blessed and full of years. He had seen the promise of offspring begin to be fulfilled through Isaac. He had lived long enough to see grandsons Esau and Jacob born. He had dwelt in the land of promise without ever owning it, living in tents but trusting that his descendants would inherit what God had sworn to give. He was gathered to his people and buried by his sons Isaac and Ishmael together, a moment of reconciliation between the separated brothers as they laid their father to rest. The writer of Hebrews summarizes Abraham's life with words that capture both the tension and the triumph of his faith. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Abraham did not see all the promises fulfilled. He did not live to see Israel become a nation, did not witness the conquest of Canaan, did not see the monarchy established or the temple built or the Messiah born. But he saw enough. He saw the promise begin to be fulfilled in Isaac. He saw faith proven on Mount Moriah. He saw God provide what he required. And that was enough. His life became a testimony that faith is not about seeing everything accomplished in your lifetime, but about trusting that God will complete what he has begun, that his promises are certain even if their fulfillment extends beyond your years, that obedience is worthwhile even when the reward is delayed, that the God who calls is faithful to complete what he starts. The story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah ends not with tragedy but with triumph, not with death but with life, not with despair but with hope, not with loss but with provision. The knife was raised but it did not fall. The son was bound but he was released. The sacrifice was required, but the substitute was supplied. And in that moment on that mountain, in that test carried to its limits, something was revealed about the nature of faith, the character of God, and the plan of redemption that would unfold across the centuries until it culminated in another son, another mountain, another sacrifice. This time completed, final, sufficient for all. Abraham, the father of faith, left a legacy that continues to shape millions of lives. He showed us what it means to trust God beyond reason, to obey beyond understanding, to surrender beyond comfort. He demonstrated that faith is not the absence of struggle, but persistence through struggle. Not certainty about outcomes, but confidence in God's character. Not possession of promises, but trust in the promise maker. And he pointed us toward the cross, where the ultimate test met the ultimate provision, where the beloved Son died as the substitute lamb, where God did not spare but gave, where the promise to bless all nations was fulfilled through the offspring who was also the sacrifice, where death was defeated and resurrection was accomplished, and hope was secured for all who believe. On the mount of the Lord it was provided. On the mount of the Lord it will always be provided. This is the legacy of Abraham, the testimony of Moriah, the promise that endures. The God who tests is the God who provides, and his provision is always sufficient, always timely, always exactly what faith requires to be strengthened, and hope to be confirmed and love to be deepened. The story that began with an impossible command and led through 3 agonizing days to a moment of supreme crisis ended with provision, blessing, and renewed promise. And that story, Abraham's story, Isaac's story, God's story, continues in the lives of all who dare to trust, who choose to obey, who climb their own Mount Moriah with their own beloved Isaacs, who raise the knife of surrender, and who discover what Abraham discovered, that the Lord provides, that obedience leads to blessing, that faith proven through testing is faith that can endure anything, and that the God who asks for everything gives back more than we surrendered, not always in the form we expected, but always sufficient for the life we are called to live.